Hello, viewers, and welcome to the first episode of Ask Cedars, the show where I answer your questions. This is actually something I've been meaning to do for a while now, and I've finally been able to get round to doing. So, without further ado, let's get stuck into these questions. There are 20 in total, and 4 of them are from the same person. So, let's start with Evelyn de la Ombre. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Evelyn. Evelyn asks, do you think that Jehovah's Witnesses will exist in 100 years' time? If you do you think they will be bigger and stronger than today or much diminished in size and influence? It's a great question. I can imagine there being Jehovah's Witnesses in 100 years' time because religions have a habit of sticking around. Once you have an idea, if there are enough people who are enthusiastic about that idea, the idea can get passed on for multiple generations. And I think we've already reached the point where the idea of the Jehovah's Witness religion is going to be around for a considerable time to come, potentially at least 100 years or more. So yes, the only question for me is whether the religion will prosper and thrive or whether it will stagnate and dwindle. I think it's more likely to stagnate, given what we're already seeing with the numbers kind of flatlining, sort of globally. I mean, if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you're proud of the fact that the growth percentage is around 1 or 2%, that is nothing to be proud of. That just basically means that you're pumping out Jehovah's Witness kids at a sufficient rate to keep the religion alive. So, no, I don't see a bright future. The next question is, do you think they will ever move away from their main doctrine of Armageddon and mass genocide of non-Jehovah's Witnesses? I don't think that they will unless it becomes a major problem when it comes to recruiting new members. I think that at the moment it is very much part of their theology, but they've managed to suppress it so well or conceal it so well or dress it up so well that no one really thinks about it. Even if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you don't really think that much about the fact that your belief, your faith entails the annihilation of everyone who doesn't happen to agree with your religious views. You just don't think of it that way. So I can't see them changing that anytime soon. Evelyn also asks, do you think that the governing body members genuinely and sincerely believe everything that they teach? I think that it's a bit more nuanced than that. I think that the human mind can be a very complicated thing, and I think that it's possible to both sincerely and genuinely believe something and to simultaneously be aware of overwhelming evidence that it's not true. So, for example, if you're a governing body member, you're going to know more than most people about the scale of the cover-up of child abuse and the human cost in terms of people dying from blood transfusions, disfellowshipping figures. You're going to have that kind of information. And yet I believe that they're deluded enough, thanks to their own kind of personal experiences and the fact that they've been given this massive privilege. I think they're deluded enough to believe that they are genuinely representatives of God and that God will fix any problems in due time. Do you have any practical tips for those who wish to remain anonymous on the internet so that they don't end up being shunned by family members? Evelyn, that's an excellent question. I actually devote a chapter to this question in my new book, How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses, which I've just finished writing, and we're already far along with the publication process. And yes, there are some basics that you can do to keep yourself off the radar. Obviously, you need to set up a pseudonym. That pseudonym can be used for Facebook, for Twitter, for Reddit, but you also need to make sure that your email isn't popping up with notifications. So in other words, if your family members can see your email, or maybe you're living in the same house and you're using a shared computer, there are lots of problems that can come up if you're not sufficiently careful about guarding your privacy. A lot of it's basically common sense, but I will be dealing with that in the book. I hope that sort of answers your question. We'll move on to Mark Runsfold, who asks, what would be a good starting place to work from in helping someone leave, both in approach and contradictory beliefs? Related, what Watchtower articles, publications, or scriptures would help in starting the conversation? I think the whole, for me, that whole question focuses on the word approach. What approach do you have with someone who is a Jehovah's Witness? Because you can't just assume that if you're speaking to a Jehovah's Witness that they are at a stage where they're ready to start questioning their beliefs. You basically need to, with your approach, you need to assume that they're not ready. You need to assume that they perhaps have one or two lingering doubts, but basically they're sold on the idea of the governing body being the faithful slave, of Jehovah's Witnesses being God's one and only true religion. And I think your approach needs to be to plant seeds. So just to express Jehovah's Witness teachings in a way that they're probably not familiar with. So rather than focus on any particular Watchtower article or publication or scripture, I think I just want to help the witness understand where I'm coming from and how my mind's working and how their beliefs sound to me. So I'd want to ask questions like, what will happen to me if I'm a good person and I live my life in a moral way, I'm kind to people, I don't do any harm to anyone? What will happen to me if, despite all that, I just don't want to be a Jehovah's Witness? I think that kind of question can really help to get cogs turning and help them to just kind of take a step back and see things from a different perspective. It won't make a radical kind of instantaneous impression on them. They won't kind of say, oh, well, what am I doing here? Why am I stood next to this literature cart? I'm going to quit being a witness. There is no magic bullet, I'm afraid. But if at the very least you can just give them something to think about when they later go home and they kind of mull over the events of the day, I think that would be a helpful approach to take. April Forbes asks, what is the best approach for waking up a partner? Now, this is similar to the previous question, but obviously we're now dealing with someone who's in the same household and is in fact, your partner, your spouse. That's a whole other issue. And I think, I talk about this in my new book, How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses, because I talk about the impact of leaving in various scenarios, including when you're married. And I talk a little bit about my experience with Deanna. Basically, the approach I took with her was to take a softly approach, where rather than bombarding her with information and, how can we possibly have been so stupid, and Jehovah's Witnesses are this and they're that, and I just basically let her come to me. And this is what I try to stress, is that when you're in a relationship, when you're married to someone, they are going to come to you at some point, because first of all, hopefully they love you if you're married, and second of all, they are not going to want to see you destroyed at Armageddon. So at some point, they are going to instigate conversations with you. And when that happens, you need to be ready, and you need to be ready to present the arguments against the Jehovah's Witness religion in a calm, rational, logical, respectful, kind way. And that can be challenging, but in my experience, it's the best way to do it. Don't bombard them with information. Let them come to you. It's a little bit different when you've discovered something that's genuinely rattled you. So, for example, when I was waking up and I was learning about the child abuse scandal, or I was learning about the UN NGO scandal, or Mexico, Malawi, or whatever, I obviously couldn't help saying, Deanna, you're never going to believe this. And excitedly conveying that discovery to her. But I think that's a bit different than pushing it in her face. That's me genuinely being alarmed and shocked by something and wanting to share it with her rather than trying to manipulate her. Basically, your husband or wife needs to both feel in control and be in control, because nobody ever leaves a cult because someone else is making them do it. They need to feel as though they are in control of the process, just as you, if you're watching this and you have woken up from the Jehovah's Witness religion, you will have felt in control when you were doing that. So I think it's important to give them that control as much as possible. Amelia asks, what books would you recommend for people new to atheism? That's a good question. I have done a book recommendations video. I guess the ones that rattle off the top of the head are A Letter to a Christian Nation by Sam Harris. That's kind of a nice introductory book because it's very short and it's targeted towards Christians rather than just people of any religion. So from the Jehovah's Witness perspective, and from the perspective of someone who is rather wary of reading this big thick book about atheism, this is quite palatable from that perspective, because again, it's very short and it's very quick and easy to read. As far as my favourite atheism books are concerned, that would have to be End of Faith by Sam Harris, or The End of Faith. God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, who's kind of my hero. And The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, although I don't consider The God Delusion to be the definitive book on atheism. I just think it's helpful to hear the perspective of a scientific mind such as that of Richard Dawkins. So those are my recommendations. Toy Elk in the Mating Season asks, how old are you? I'm 38. That was an easy one to answer. A.G. Kent asks, what is the basis for scriptural divorce? So, scriptural divorce is basically the witness lingo for, is this divorce allowable according to our rules? So, for example, you could get divorced by for any number of reasons and get a legal divorce according to the state, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have a scriptural divorce by Jehovah's Witness standards. So you could, in theory, get a divorce and get your papers through and everything, but according to the Jehovah's Witness religion, you're not free to remarry because you don't have a scriptural divorce. And to have a scriptural divorce, what you need basically is for either party to have committed adultery. There needs to be adultery for there to be a divorce. There's no other allowance given, even in the case of one spouse being abused in some way. There's no other allowance given for marriages to be terminated. And I think that that's one of the most sickening aspects of Jehovah's Witness teachings, because it puts abused women in this situation where, even though they are being violated, they have to basically remain tethered to this person for life, because the best they can hope for is a separation, which means that they're not allowed to marry anyone else. So I hope that explains what a scriptural divorce is. Martin Howe asks, can you make a short video on remolding, I guess you mean remodeling your apartment? I love looking at your old videos and seeing what it looked like. It could be this old house with Lloyd. Martin, well, yes, if you've watched some of my very earliest videos, which I now cringe when I watch, because I feel as though you inevitably develop in your style in front of the camera the more videos you make. So when I watch my earliest videos, which were filmed in the apartment when it was still basically bricks and mortar, I find them difficult to watch. I'm obviously not going to take them down or anything, but Martin would like to see the transition, and I have actually considered doing a video where I do like a tour of the apartment and show people around and show people what it used to look like. There is actually a picture of what it used to look like in my book, interestingly enough. But I just decided, and I actually went as far as to start filming that video once. But I think Deanna and I just decided that we needed to kind of draw a line when it comes to privacy. So my activism work is already kind of sharing so much of my life with thousands of people. It would be nice to have boundaries where, well, this is what you guys get to see and this is what only we get to see. So I think that's a healthy thing. And as a result of that, I'm afraid I won't be doing a tour of the apartment. But that's not to say that you can't still see the apartment, because I try as much as possible. When I get to film in the living area, because that's difficult nowadays with Jessica, when I get to film in the living area, I try as much as possible to do different angles so that you guys get like a slightly interesting view. But yeah, I just think it's important to have some things that can be just for me and Deanna. So I'm sure you understand that. Free Activist asks, can I ask your view on the idea that some JWs in certain cultures apparently don't shun their relatives as their culture is more family orientated and the idea of shunning doesn't fit in? Have you heard of this? And how does a JW psychologically deal with going against the organisation? I guess those are two different questions. It's going to be very difficult psychologically in terms of cognitive dissonance to do something that you know is wrong, because regardless of what country you're in, the rules on shunning are very, very clear, and every country gets the same material in their conventions. And obviously we had, as recently as 2016, we had the convention video showing very clearly that a mother and father shouldn't even pick up the phone when a disfellowshipped daughter is ringing. So the rules are very clear. So it must cause issues psychologically to knowingly go against those rules, especially when you know that the penalty for failing to meet with God's approval is annihilation at Armageddon. I guess I can imagine there being different cultures and more laid back attitudes towards shunning. But just to give you some idea, I happen to live in a country where family is everything. I mean, here in Croatia, the family unit is very, very strong. And it's just assumed that if you're related to someone, you're going to be close to them, to the point where people are close to even kind of uncles and cousins. There's this very tight-knit community mentality when it comes to the family. But even here, Jehovah's Witnesses shun or are urged to shun disfellowshipped or disassociated family members. So I guess it's always possible for there to be exceptions to the rule, but I can only imagine it causing considerable internal conflict when you are knowingly going against what the faithful slave has told you, with the risk of being destroyed at Armageddon. So, Sarah Harris asks, why is the Watchtower more concerned with anti-LGBTQ propaganda than addressing the child abuse and domestic violence that exists in their organisation? Sarah, that's an excellent question. You would have to ask them. I can only join you in being absolutely gobsmacked that there can be this continued crusade against gay people, against lesbians, against the LGBTQ community, when they have such pressing issues to deal with where children are at risk. I mean, that doesn't mean that it's right to go after LGBTQ people, but it's even more reprehensible when they have more pressing issues, such as children being exposed to the worst of humanity and having their abuse covered up. So I share your disgust that can be the case. Francis Bean Cobain asks, it's quite a long, it's in two parts. Do you think the governing body subconsciously feels the need to protect God from himself? Example, the teaching that God can see all the future but chooses not to, only selectively, thus shielding God from criticism. Perhaps a form of cognitive dissonance when it comes to what the Bible actually says about God versus the nice little box that Watchtower would like to put God into in order to have a more appealing version of him. Francis, it's a great observation. I think it's true that Watchtower does water down certainly the Bible in terms of making some of the more gruesome aspects of Christian theology more palatable. And an example that immediately springs to mind is the passage about Jephthah's daughter, where if you read in the original Bible, if you compare different translations, it's just obvious that Jephthah kills his daughter as a sacrifice because he's made this vow, this stupid, ridiculous vow, and he follows through with it and he kills his daughter as a sacrifice. But Watchtower retells this story so that Jephthah's daughter gets sent off to become a nun. Essentially, she has to serve at the tabernacle, where she's visited by the daughters of Israel, which just isn't in the original. So I think that's a good example of some of the more gruesome passages in the Bible being watered down. And you give the example of God's character being excused for. If God is truly omnipotent, if he knows everything, why would he have done things in the kind of convoluted way that he has done them, so that his solution for bringing about a world where there is perfect justice involves there being millennia of human suffering? Well, Watchtower's answer, as you say, is that God selectively decides to use his foreknowledge. So yeah, it amounts to making excuses for the Creator. Robert asks, do you sometimes catch yourself subconsciously going back to a JW habit or thought? I mean, when I'm really exhausted, I sometimes catch myself starting a prayer and literally a second later I think to myself, WTF? I haven't believed this BS for a long time. Robert, I think a lot of people who hear your question will be able to relate to that experience. I certainly can. And it's, I guess, when you spend years and years and years in an extremely repetitive, ritualistic routine, where the minute you sit down for a meal, for example, it's, oh, well, we need to say a prayer. It's just inevitable that that's going to carry through, even years after you've stopped believing. So there are times when Deanna and myself and Jessica will sit down for a meal, and there will just be this kind of awkward pause, not necessarily from Deanna, but it will feel as though, oh, this is the moment when we need to pray. And this is despite the fact that I'm now an atheist. So, yeah, it's just inevitable when you're so heavily programmed in this very ritual-based form of worship and form of behavior. It's inevitable that you're going to revert to it from time to time. Julia Hull, we're getting to near the end now. Julia Hull asks, is it true that in the 1900s coloured people had to stand at the back of the church? I think what Julia is referring to is Charles Taze Russell and his segregation of black people. And I'm not aware of it being a common practice, but there is at least one example of it that I can think of and that I write about in my book, when in 1914, when they were showing the photodrome of creation, there was this huge controversy because at a theatre in New York, the blacks were segregated and made to sit up in the gallery, I think it was, away from the rest of the audience, and that caused understandable outrage. So right back from the beginning of the organisation, you have this ugly, backward attitude towards racial equality and that kind of thing. Obviously, you don't have it today, but the fact remains that it was very much a part of Watchtower history, which is why I devote a number of pages to that aspect of Watchtower history in my book. And I also wrote a JW survey article. I think it's called something like The History of Racism in Watchtower Literature or something like that, where I go into that in more detail. Karina Cunningham asks, would you be disfellowshipped if you left your husband? And would you be disfellowshipped if you went out, got drunk, then slept with a stranger so you could get a divorce? I don't know whether you'd be disfellowshipped just for literally walking out on your husband without any communication as to what you're doing. If you were to have an adulterous affair and you weren't, and you had a judicial committee and you didn't show repentance, then yes, you would be disfellowshipped. I guess that's the best answer I can give you to your question. Phasomania asks, now that the yearbook is no longer printed, is it possible to still get hold of the membership statistics? Yes and no, Phasomania. We actually touched on this in one of our Watchtower in Focus episodes. They promised that the yearbook statistics, the yearly report would still be available on jw.org, just not in the yearbook. And I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt that meant that they would literally release all of the figures they had been releasing, just not in the yearbook. And it turned out that they did, in fact, use that opportunity to give a slightly less comprehensive version of the figures. So if you go on, if you Google jw.org annual report, you're gonna come up with a PDF download, which gives you a country by country breakdown. But what that doesn't include is some of the statistics specific to congregations. I forget which statistics aren't on there, but crucially it doesn't include the average publishers, which is the figure that's used to arrive at the growth statistics, the growth percentage. So rather annoying that they have indeed used this opportunity to just slightly reduce the amount of information that we get about Watchtower figures. But yeah, that's the answer to your question. Juicer Servo says, what is the most effective thing to say to a Jehovah's Witness when you see them with their brochure stands I've seen them more often lately and want to engage with them in a polite and constructive manner, but I'm not sure what to say. Thanks. I guess this, on reflection, ties in quite closely with the earlier question that I answered about how to approach a Jehovah's Witness. Again, just try to be kind, try to be loving, recognize that these are people who are not in full control of their thinking or behavior. So if they say something that's offensive or they say something that's ridiculous, try not to see it as them saying it. Try to see it as they're just parroting what Watchtower wants them to say. And rather than kind of pursue a battle with them and try to attain some kind of victory, it's better to just take them on a brief journey with you of how your mind works and the logical issues that you have with the fundamentals of their belief system. So the example I gave earlier was, if I'm a good person, if I'm always nice to people and do whatever I can to help people, I just don't want to be a Jehovah's Witness. Are you really telling me I'm going to die at Armageddon? It could be that a Jehovah's Witness would answer that falsely, because it seems that there are some Jehovah's Witnesses who have their own version of what the beliefs are regarding Armageddon, and they say things like, oh, well, God will read your heart and God will know you're a good person. So it's up to God. But the bottom line is, if you read Watchtower literature and you do research on the issue, you do find that it unequivocally says that you're going to die if you're not a Jehovah's Witness, as was recently underscored by Tony Morris in his talk in Trinidad, where he said that if you fail to sufficiently participate in the preaching work, guess what? You're going to die at Armageddon because you have blood on your hands, which for me just illustrates it perfectly. So yes, just rather than try to win a battle or be kind of combative or confrontational, just try to take them on like a little magical mystery tour around what it feels like to be free and what it feels like to be able to ask questions that they wouldn't ordinarily be free to ask. That's my best advice. Safi De90 asks, if you could somehow be capable of having a single governing body member leave the cult or what have you, what would that member be and why? Safi, that's an excellent question. Not one I have been asked before, I don't think. I think if I had to pick a governing body member who would wake up from the indoctrination and go on to basically do a Ray Franz, where they become part of the movement and they lend their voice and their experience of the inner workings to help others awaken, it would need to be one of the more credible members. I actually think Tony Morris is doing fantastic work for the ex-witness movement where he is now, and I wouldn't want to interfere with that. I'm happy for Tony to carry on saying and doing outrageous things. I wouldn't want to recruit someone like Stephen Lett. I'm not particularly interested in recruiting someone like Jeffrey Jackson, who disgraced himself by lying to the Royal Commission. It would need to be someone more credible, and I think I would choose Mark Sanderson, because although I have my issues with Mark Sanderson, for example, I write in my book about how he's been very vocal about child baptism, for example. He at least strikes me as being the most sensible and presentable and credible of the governing body members. He comes across very well on camera. He seems very reasonable when he's talking, even when he's talking nonsense. So if I had to choose a governing body member to wake up and help represent our movement, I guess I'd choose him. Which brings me to my final question, which is in the form of a voicemail, which we will now listen to.
Hello, Lloyd. I would like to know how can I get your latest book, How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses? Please let me know. I want a copy, please. Okay, man. Thanks.
So, yes, the question there was, how do I get a copy of your book, How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses? Thank you for that voicemail. The simple answer is that you have to wait, I'm afraid, and the amount of waiting you do depends on whether you pre-ordered a copy on Indiegogo. So there's about 100 copies that have been pre-ordered on Indiegogo, which I first need to get printed and signed and sent out, which I'm going to be doing towards the end of March, so towards the end of next month. And part of the Indiegogo terms was that there's going to be a period after I've mailed the last copy before the book goes up on Amazon, so that it genuinely is a pre-order rather than them getting their copy at the same time as everyone else gets theirs on Amazon. So I need to give I think it was like a 3-week period for those copies to arrive, and then the book will go on Amazon. But that gives me time to put the finishing touches to the book and make it as good as I can possibly make it. I can tell you that it's more or less finished in terms of both the writing and the actual design of the book file. There's just a few niggling things that need to be done. I also want to make sure for this book that there will be an audiobook version of it at the same time as it becomes available in hard copy and Kindle. With The Reluctant Apostate, it's harder to make an audiobook version because it's 800 pages long. And I think, as I expressed in a previous video, 800 pages works out at something like 200,000 words. Whereas How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses is around 35,000 words. So it's much more manageable for me to sit down and narrate 35,000 words than 200,000 words. So I aim to have the book available in hard copy, Kindle and audiobook simultaneously, and that will hopefully be, or it will be, I should say, at least by April. So April will be the release date, and you can be sure that there will be a video on this channel giving you an announcement when it's available. So those are all the questions that I have for this inaugural episode of Ask Cedars. If you'd like me to answer your questions in episode 2, all you need to do is, well, there's actually 3 ways of asking your question. First of all, you can ask it in the comments below. So when I'm preparing the next episode, I'm going to go through the comments below and select questions to answer that way. You can also, if you're on Twitter, you can tweet me a question, and all you need to do is add the hashtag AskCedars, and that's another way you can submit your questions. And the third way, which is my personal favourite, is voicemail, as we've just heard. I always like hearing the voices come through, if you're in a position to share your voice, that is. So all you need to do to send a voicemail is go to speakpipe.com/Cedars, and it should be fairly self-explanatory. But basically, that's the first episode of Ask Cedars. I hope you found it interesting. Please don't forget to subscribe for more videos, and as always, thank you for watching.